This is the Steele Report.
This week on the Steele Report, I finally get to air a program I wanted to air 3 months ago, but then COVID-19 hit and the Grout Museum had to close. Well, today I'll look at the Grout's new exhibit on women's suffrage, 100 years. Recorded just prior to COVID, so that's why you're not going to see any social distancing in this show. Later, you're going to meet a local foster family and also get an interesting perspective on the 4th congressional district race. Our program begins right now.
Now from KWWL, this is the Steele Report.
And welcome to this week's edition of the Steele Report. We have a great topic for you here today, as it's going to center around a special 100-year anniversary coming up this summer in the United States, and also a special historical exhibit which is currently underway at the very popular Grout Museum in downtown Waterloo. So the exhibit is called Remember the Ladies, The Path to Suffrage, as Americans celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which guarantees and protects a woman's constitutional right to vote. And our guests are here, of course, to talk about that struggle and this Grout Museum exhibit, which is underway right now and will continue for many, many months down the road. So let's introduce our guests right now. First of all, Sonia Johansson, great to have her on the show here today. She's a former 3-term Black Hawk County supervisor, and I'm going to call you a local historian too, Sonia, if you don't mind, here today. She's also a 3-term mayor of LaPorte City. In fact, I think it was 4 terms. You went 3 terms once, and then we're off for a little bit, and then another term on the Black Hawk County Board of Supervisors. So great to see you back here on the show here today. Also, Teresa Hoffman, of course, is a well-known Cedar Valley attorney for the local law firm of Beecher, Field, Walker, Morris, Hoffman, and Johnson. But Teresa is here today as she's representing the Pauline Barrett Charitable Foundation, and that foundation is a major sponsor of the suffrage exhibit at the Grout Museum. And also please welcome Al Sweeney. Al is the facilities manager for the Grout Museum District, which includes the likes of the Museum and History and Science Building, the Blue Dorn Science Imaginarium, the Russell House, the Snowden House, the Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum. Al, you are a very busy man with all those great facilities in the Grout District. And Sonia, isn't it amazing that women had to wait 150 years to vote, but now you're the most powerful, most influential voting bloc in the country?
Well, that is very true, because there are more of us at the moment than there are guys. But my grandmother was 40 years old before she could vote. And when I was just a little girl, she said to me, you know, you got to keep an eye on those guys to make sure that they don't try to take it away from you again.
Well, I think one of your own exhibits over there, I think Mrs. Adams says something to her husband about treating ladies better than they have been treated. Is that one of the things over there on your wall? Yeah, exactly.
Well, that was a letter to her husband, and expressing the need to be conscious of the women in the country, and that if women weren't given a greater voice, men would wreak havoc in the world.
And that's probably true, isn't it?
Well, I think women have always been influential, but never been given the opportunity to really have their voices count at the ballot box until 100 years ago.
So when you look at this exhibit, Al, I mean, first of all, where did you get the exhibit? How did you come up with all the things that are going to be there for the next several months?
The exhibit was actually developed in-house at the museum by the exhibit staff.
So it's not one of those museums that travels around the country. You did this from scratch, basically,
This one was built from scratch,
wow.
Yes. And the majority of the objects in the exhibit are either directly out of the Grout Museum's collection, or we borrowed some from the State Historical Society of Iowa as well. And another contributor who's a professor at UNI, she had a very large collection of suffrage pieces, including anti-suffrage pieces, which there are very, very few left, because after the 19th Amendment passed, everybody that had voiced against it basically didn't want to admit that they had voiced against it. So some of those, very few of those objects survived, and she was kind enough to let us borrow those for over a year, which is hugely beneficial to us.
Ron, I was fascinated by one of the exhibits there, which is a wagon that the women rode in parades, and it's a tall, skinny wagon. So that kind of thing is fascinating to see.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I'll ask each of you to kind of go through and give me some highlights of this exhibit. What are your favorites, or what are some of the things that are most important to you, and what bring back maybe memories or something you think was a significant part of the women's movement?
Actually, in the exhibit, I was fascinated to see some of the other local women's historical comments and the reasons that they decided to be involved.
Actually, as director of exhibits, it's my first one that I've ever been in charge of. But the exhibit has so many unique pieces to it, including, you know, the home diorama, the office diorama, the photo mural opportunity where you can actually put on a sash and pose with suffragettes and take a photo and post it to social media or however you want to do it. And there's also a video interview that starts with the governor speaking.
This exhibit tells the story of the national and Iowa suffrage movement and the ongoing quest for gender equity, which continues today.
And it goes through several women who have been involved in politics.
They are finally free to be themselves. Betty Friedan.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady said.
Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Abigail Adams.
And actually all the way down to my 9-year-old daughters in the introduction video, telling people to listen to these quotes because it's important. And for me, that actually illustrates the importance for, the exhibit's important for people to remember the past, obviously, but think about where we're going ahead. That's why we put someone like my daughter in that exhibit, because, you know, a lot of this depends, her future depends on a lot of how we act today. And maybe when she's my age, maybe there'll be another exhibit about how far we've come since today until she's, you know, up in my age range.
Oh, great. All right, Al, thanks very much. That's a great answer there, and glad to know that your daughter is involved in this. And Teresa, you've been down there. You're a part of this, one of the major sponsors with Pauline's foundation, the Pauline Barrett Charitable Foundation. What do you think is the most memorable part of this exhibit to you?
Well, I love the vignettes on the different women that were major players, and I also love the fact that there's such an Iowa connection on that, people kind of forget about Iowa at times, that we're here in the heart of the country, but how much we do impact politics. That's certainly being first in the country with our caucuses, but also the impact that those women from Iowa had to stand up for those rights. I also, the girl in me likes the exhibits on the costumes that they used to wear, which, you know, we kind of look at as costumes, but they're really they really signified the women's movement at that point in time as far as what they were wearing, whether it's the banners or the dresses, the hats. It's all a very important part of who they were and what they were striving to achieve.
And Al, you were mentioning that there's really an area that really focuses on just the Iowans' roles in this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a specific part of the exhibit that focuses on 8 to 10 Iowa suffragists. And there's actually nationally, there's over 30 biographies of different suffragists within the exhibit. And not only women, there were quite a few men involved with the movement as well. And there's just some fascinating stories about the hardships that these certain ladies went through, and including not just mental hardships, there's physical. A lot of them were actually threatened with physical violence, and actually when they were doing walks and speeches and things like that, had to hire protection, including the Boy Scouts, actually ended up doing security for a lot of these marches, which we found fascinating when we started doing research.
All kinds of really horrendous things, so they had to show a lot of courage.
Absolutely.
That was a scary time for women.
Absolutely,
I mean, it's
it
still a
would have
scary
been.
time in many ways. But I mean, back then, to think that you would take a stand in a man's world and be at the threat of physical violence and who knows what else, you know, that's the point you make is well taken. Yeah.
And physical violence not only out in public, but when they got home, because a lot of them had to buck family members also who did not want them out there for one reason or another. It took a tremendous amount of courage and strength to take that stand.
We will continue our discussion on the Grout Museum exhibit in just one moment. Welcome back. Let's hear more about the women's suffrage exhibit right now at the Grout Museum. Just take a moment here real quick. I want to thank Pat Kenny, former Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier reporter who's now retired, working for the Grout Museum, for lining up our interviews here today.
The exhibit's open currently, and it'll actually run until March of 2021. And hopefully people come back to see it.
Let me ask you, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but how many visitors does the Grout Museums have during the course of a year?
Oh, over 30,000 a year.
30,000 a year. Wow, that's great. That's a nice number.
Yeah.
Teresa, you represent the Pauline Barrett Charitable Foundation, and Pauline was 96 years old when she died back in 2018, just a couple of years ago, after she donated literally millions and millions of dollars to great local events and charities here around the area. So when you look at this exhibit, which the Pauline Barrett Foundation is a big sponsor of. What are you most proud of?
I'm proud of the fact that this is something that Pauline would have been thrilled to have been part of. She was always very dedicated to providing opportunities for future generations, advocating for those future generations, just like those women 100 years ago were advocating not just for themselves, but for all the women to come, and recognize that they had to step out of the box, be very visible and vocal, not just for themselves, but for the future generations and the future of the country. This is something that Pauline would have been thrilled to have been part of.
Absolutely. So,
we're at about 23 million, which will provide grants, gifts to charities throughout the Cedar Valley to again continue that same gifting that she has done in the past to concentrate on education, which this display is a phenomenal opportunity for education, especially for our youth, healthcare, all of those things that were so important to her. This will allow her legacy to continue.
wow.
Just like the legacy of those women 100 years ago to continue on to the future, Pauline will be able to do the same thing through her giving.
To clarify, Teresa, you're talking about a foundation that really was established after Pauline's death.
Yes,
right?
it's in its infancy. We really got going last year on that. We'll be fully funded this year in 2020.
Well, that's fantastic, and that will keep alive the memory of her and her family and the things that she wanted to do and the things that were important to her in the Cedar Valley. And boy, it's almost numerous. Can you think just off the top of your head some of the things she's done?
Well, she's provided large scholarships for students going to University of Northern Iowa. She's given grants to Allen Hospital, especially with their School of Nursing. The YWCA, she was thrilled to be able to tell the story how she came from a little town, a farm community in Iowa, took the bus to the YWCA, got off the bus, went there to get a room, got a room, strapped on her high-heeled shoes and walked to Rath to get a job, when that was not a very easy thing to do.
Exactly. I was reading about the fact she actually worked at the Rath Packing Company at the
and
time.
walked there.
Just amazing, just absolutely.
In high heels.
In high heels. In high heels. There were no sneakers for women back then, I don't think.
So I want to mention that there are other sponsors of this great exhibit. These kind of sponsors make this happen, Al. You can't really do it without them, right?
Absolutely not. The Grout, we've always considered ourselves a community organization, even though we're a private organization as well. But without this, the support of sponsors such as the Pauline Barrett Foundation and all the other sponsors you listed, as well as just community support in general, these exhibits and programming that we provide wouldn't be possible.
You know, the movement itself actually started with what they called the, if memory serves me correctly, the Seneca, New York Convention, which goes back to 1848, and that's kind of like the official date in all historians of the official start of the women's movement. And then out of that, it was interesting, it started the movement, and then in 1869, it had slowed down because of the Civil War before picking back up. Does this exhibit show any of those dates and the significance? Yeah.
Absolutely. When we developed the exhibit, we actually developed the exhibit as a complete timeline.
Okay.
Starting, the first date you see in the exhibit is 1776, going back to Abigail Adams' quote in the letter that she wrote her husband when they were drafting the original documents for the country. And Remember the Ladies is how the title of the exhibit came around. And then you can follow that timeline, and the timeline doesn't stop with 1919 or 1920. We actually continue up until today, because after, when the 19th Amendment passed, the struggle for women's equality wasn't over, and it's still not over to this day. And those are the things that we're trying to highlight, so such as the formation of the League of Women Voters and the Equal Rights Amendment movement and things like that. We highlight all of those pieces throughout the exhibit past 1919.
That's fantastic. In fact, out of that Seneca Convention, they had what was called a delegation of sentiment, which kind of changed the Constitution a little bit in the way it was spoken anyway. It said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, which closely modeled the Declaration of Independence, the original words there. So all of this is part of your exhibit, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right, not forgetting the past, right?
Well, we can't forget the past because it helps shape our future, but also how much strength and courage it took to take a position that wasn't overwhelmingly popular and to do that for future generations, and how we now have that obligation to have that same strength of spirit and fortitude to go forward, to keep making those changes, because we're not equal yet in so many different ways. The wage gap still exists. It's improving a little bit every year, but still not there, which means we can't get lazy. We can't forget how hard they worked, and that we as women still need to work for those future generations, our daughters and granddaughters, providing those same opportunities so that, as Sonia said, her grandmother told her, don't let them take it away.
And you know, I recently just discovered that the black women still, after the 1920s, did not have the right to vote. They had to memorize the Constitution and I don't know what all before they would let them vote. I think that's just horrendous. They didn't make the guys do that.
No.
Teresa, you were kind of shocked that a number of people don't even know that it's the 100-year anniversary coming up, right?
I was. I mentioned the exhibit to many people, and so many of them had no idea about the 100th anniversary. It's not being played out much anywhere, which is surprising to me because it's a very big milestone. And I don't know whether it doesn't get enough play in our history books or it's not in front of anyone for you to be able to think about it, but in this day and age, I think it's really important that we do make people aware of this.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where we obviously take things for granted and we forget of all the many, many sacrifices that so many people made, so we can just sit here and talk about this at our leisure. It's amazing, yeah.
Well, we become complacent.
Yeah.
And that movement shouldn't be over. It isn't over until the wage gap has been narrowed down, till other opportunities that the doors are not open or as open as they should be, that we all have to keep on that same struggle, you know, to make sure that we are trying to open up doors and to change laws that have no basis other than in gender inequality.
When you look back, a lot of people would say, you know, we just weren't very smart back then. We didn't understand equality. We didn't understand that everybody is equal. There's no excuse for that, obviously, but I mean, now we see this evolution which is taking place right now, so that's a good thing. But again, not forgetting the past is really, really important. Yeah. Good point, Sarah.
We all have to remember that we're all human beings, no matter what our gender, no matter what our color, and we're all God's children.
Yes.
Sonia, what do you miss about
working.
local politics since you were on the board for 4 terms? Do you miss anything about it? Or?
Oh, I miss the people. I don't see them nearly enough as I used to.
That's too bad, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of is.
Now, I want to ask also, you have the rosettes that you can purchase. So what's that all about?
The rosettes were just an idea during the movement, especially at the turn of the century. A lot of the women's organizations wore ribbons and rosettes for the pro-suffrage movement. So we thought it would be a neat idea that you can actually purchase a rosette that's displayed on the wall throughout the entire run of the exhibit, and you can buy one for, you know, your mother, your wife, your daughter, anyone who's significant in your life, and actually dedicate the rosette for them. So we have everyone from museum employees to we actually put one up for Pauline Barrett, you know, and there's Viridian employees, and right now, as of right now, there's almost 100 rosettes up, and they're actually available for sale throughout the entire run of the exhibit.
So plenty of time to actually get down there and see it. Also, schools are invited, right?
Absolutely. We're actually hoping to get everybody from elementary through high school kids through the exhibit, and all the teachers have to do is call the museum and book a tour.
So once again, the exhibit at the Grout Museum is called Remember the Ladies, The Path to Suffrage, coming up on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment passage finally. So Al, I'll give you the last word here. Just give us the spiel about why people need to come down and take a look at this great exhibit.
Well, as Teresa alluded to earlier, you learn from history. History is always very important, but history helps us look to the future as well, I think. And this is, you know, as Teresa had said, not a lot of people are aware that it's a 100th anniversary. I think that makes it not only important, but it makes us think about the future ahead, the children. Sonia had mentioned, you know, all of us have kids and things like that. But I want people to know what everyone else went through to get us to this point, because we have made great strides, but there's many, many more strides to go yet.
So it's a great exhibit. It's down at the Grout Museum right now, so be sure to check that out. We'll continue on here on the Steele Report in just a moment. And welcome back. You know, there's always a great need for more foster parents in Iowa. And for National Foster Care Month, I recently featured a Waterloo couple who has made a lifelong commitment to foster care and now adoption. I want you to meet the Dunn family.
Good catch.
Good job.
I think foster care is something that people think about for a long time before they're ready to commit.
Chris and Jordan Dunn made their commitment to become foster parents about 6 years ago. It was a life-changing decision for the Waterloo couple, bringing 3 children into their home. Michael is now 14, 11-year-old Paul,
8.
and this is 8-year-old Bradley.
Foster families can be from really diverse backgrounds. I think for both of us, just knowing that it was a need that in this community and across Iowa isn't really being met yet, that there are not enough foster families, not enough homes for kids that need them, that really spoke to us.
Jordan and Chris made an even greater commitment beyond foster care when they decided to legally adopt Bradley, Paul, and Michael.
All these kids want is a loving home, and knowing that we would be able to provide that to them, you know, it spoke volume, and so we wanted to make sure that we are giving back to the community.
Wouldn't be in a nice home like this, though.
Michael, a West High student, is certainly appreciative of his family.
I like being here because they provide a nice place for me to live, and they very much care about how I'm doing, and they just care. That's a big difference.
And I would rather be here than be anywhere else.
Paul says his parents do it all for them.
Well, I feel really good about them. They're super caring, they're loving, they always look out for us, and they always put some of our needs before theirs.
One's 14 and one's 11.
Bradley takes pride in his big brothers and knows why foster families are so important to so many Iowa kids.
Since we just need a place for people to live and learn a lot of things.
And you said stay safe?
Yeah, to stay safe and just have a good life.
Have a good life.
It just brings me back to those situations and that, like, what it would be like if I didn't have a family to go to, and it was just like, I wouldn't be well, so we really need a foster parents to be able to take care of kids.
Again, I think it's really important to mention that the goal of foster care is always reunification and supporting those birth families. I would encourage anyone to visit the Four Oaks Family Connections website to learn more about the process and have your questions answered.
They make it very interactive. It's a very fun process, and the connections you make with other foster families is leaps and bounds. Some of our best friends are now foster families as well, and so it's a really unique opportunity to help create more of an umbrella of support for you.
Perhaps Bradley sums it up best.
Having a nice place to live is amazing.
Well said, Bradley. No doubt about that. Check out the Four Oaks Family Connections webpage for information on becoming a foster parent. And as we wrap up for today, Republican voters in Iowa's 4th District recently ousted 9-term Congressman Steve King in the recent primary, nominating State Senator Randy Feenstra. A couple of years ago, J.D. Scholten came within a couple of points of beating Steve King, giving King his closest race ever. This time, Republicans were quite concerned that if King won the primary, that would give Scholten the early advantage. But what now, with Randy Feenstra winning the nomination? Do the Republicans have a better chance now of retaining that seat now that Randy Feenstra is the candidate, rather than if Steve King would have been the candidate, since Scholten was so close in the last race?
Well, I think that's the assumption among Republicans, and that's why there was the move by party elites to encourage not only State Senator Randy Feenstra to run, but also for Congressman King to step aside. The assumption was that Congressman King was just simply too controversial to win in the district, particularly against a candidate like J.D. Scholten, who had demonstrated a lot of appeal the last election cycle. But now a lot of national observers are saying that, well, now you're talking about, this is a district that still is very much Republican in terms of party registration. And so now a lot of people are looking at it, well, now that you have what I think people consider to be a less controversial Republican, that Republicans will turn out in force to support State Senator Randy Feenstra. And if that's the case, that makes it more difficult for J.D. Scholten this time around.
Yeah, and Randy Feenstra really philosophically looks like Steve King in a lot of areas, doesn't he?
He does, and I think that's kind of being hidden a little bit. Everybody is looking at, well, it's not Congressman King, that means it's a more moderate Republican, and that's not necessarily the case. He is still a very conservative Republican, as you said, but he's not a controversial Republican like Congressman King.
And thanks again to Dr. Chris Larimer, Professor of Political Science at UNI, and our KWWL political analyst for his insight. Unfortunately, we're out of time. That's it for now. We'll be back here next week.